Who cares about Watchmen? Episode 2, Martial Feats of Comanche Horsemanship. Before we get into episode 2, just quickly, I'm Gig. I'm a diehard Alan Moore fan and recent convert to Lindelothianism. From Australia, we have Neo, who usually do the intro. He's an Australian long-time fan of Watchmen and a great fan of Lindelof's recent television work. From America, we have Broken Mirrors, who is pained from how much he's enjoying a show he didn't expect to like this much. And joining us this week is another Englishman, Dilb. Dilb, what's your experience with Watchmen, show, comic, otherwise, whatever? What's your experience?
Well, I kind of skimmed through it when I was 12, sort of more attracted to the aesthetics of it, but I've been reading it like in the past week, but I've only read the first 2 chapters, so I'm kind of bringing in a perspective of vague familiarity with, most of it, I guess. I sort of know what's going on.
Well, that's about as much as you need, isn't it, really? Before we unleash the takes, I think I'm just going to do a quick recap of the episode and try and make it as speedy as possible, but there is a lot to cover. So we have this prologue in World War I. We have a German propaganda flyer dictated, which is directed at American soldiers of colour, covering how poorly treated they are and how hypocritical America is for asking them to serve. This message transfers down through the generations. It reaches OB, and then it reaches OB's son, Will, who we then meet as a 105-year-old man because he read it on this flyer. And in the present, Will is insisting to Angela Abar, aka Sister Knight, that he was the one who lynched Police Chief Judd Crawford, possibly with psychic powers or something. Angela interrogates him, but he insists that he's already given her the clues. Now, Angela goes with the other masked vigilantes to collect Judd's body, and that transitions into a flashback where she relives the experience of the White Night, when she and her husband Calvin got attacked by Rorschach masked killers, and for some mysterious reason, she narrowly survived. She woke up and Judd was there to comfort her, and together they resolved to stay on in the police force and somehow rebuild it, even though countless people were resigning or were just, dead. So back in the present, the cops, they argue over what to do, but ultimately they decide they're all going to go to Nixonville, which is this enclave of anti-Redford, anti-government, poor white people, and basically just round them all up very brutally, very violently, without any real evidence. And we also see a segment from American Hero Story covering the exploits of hooded justice, done in this very sort of slow-mo, very sensationalistic way. And we see hooded justice beat the crap out of some criminal in a way not dissimilar to what we saw Angela doing in Nixonville to someone who tried to attack her. So, and then later on we transition out of that, and Angela visits Jane and Judd's house for this sort of kind of morning reception, kind of wake thing. And Angela cleverly kind of maneuvers herself to get into the bedroom and investigates Judd's closet, in which she finds an old Klan robe complete with a sheriff's star. Now, from that, we transition into the kind of Lord of the Manor location, wherever the hell that is, where said Lord of the Manor, played by Jeremy Irons, is directing his play about the origins of God/superhero Dr. Manhattan. And this recaps some events that we saw in the Watchmen comic. And he burns one of his servants alive in the process. All of the servants turn out to be identical duplicates of the 2 we met initially, Mr. Phillips and Mrs. Crookshanks. So some of them are the female and some of them are the male, and we don't know what the hell's going on there. Meanwhile, back in Tulsa, Will, who is wheelchair bound but has mysteriously escaped the handcuffs that were placed on him by Angela, he turns out, thanks to some DNA investigating, to be Angela's grandfather. And he says he wants to show her where she came from. Rather than opening up to him and asking him some questions, Angela decides to put him under arrest, but this turns out to be a mistake, because just as she puts him in the car, this gigantic UFO turns up, puts a massive magnet on top of the car, and drags it away into the sky as Will smirks at her out of the rearview mirror. So, yeah, what do we all think?
A lot more happens in this one than in the premiere, it sounds like.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
You remember how last week I was in such pain over how good the show was? I don't have that problem this week, yeah. I'm happy with how trash it is. I'm happy with how absurd and ridiculous it is, and in both good ways and bad ways. Intentional and unintentional, I find that this is becoming a lot more entertaining in a weird way. If that makes sense? It doesn't matter if it doesn't.
Yeah, I liked this episode more because I felt like it had a lot more stylistic touches that I liked. It felt more like the comic, like we had overlapping voiceovers and paralleling narratives, like the American Hero Story stuff bleeding over into Angela's scenes. But I also felt like a lot of the appeal of the premiere was how mysterious it was, and it didn't go out of its way to explain itself. But then this episode was a lot more exposition and, flashbacks explaining people's relationships and explaining why this happens and explaining what this means, which I enjoyed, but it's a lot more unwieldy and kind of less interesting than the premiere was. But I did actually enjoy this episode more, even though I'm kind of slagging it off there. So there you go.
It felt a bit like issue 2 of the comic with the flashbacks. Like, they have the match cut where Angela's holding onto the chief's body, and then it match cuts to her holding onto her husband.
So many match cuts this episode. That was really cool.
And another thing that this episode really brings back from the comic, it's easy to forget, given Matthew Good's performance in the film and how much people have sort of reclaimed Ozymandias as, like, people like Lindelof himself saying Ozymandias was right to kill all those people. I think it's actually kind of refreshing to have a reminder, oh yeah, and he's also totally insane. I am going to remain, until we have a better grasp on the situation, I'm going to remain in the team fight camp regarding the man in the high castle.
Yeah, this episode actually converted me. And what the interesting thing was, it wasn't that his horse's name was the same name as Alexander the Great's horse, and of course Ozymandias idolizes Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that he talks about the Gordian knot, which was something Ozymandias in the comic talked about. It was actually all the misdirections. Like, at the opening of the episode, Angela's grandfather just kind of stops the episode to a halt to go, oh, did you know Dr. Manhattan can pretend to be human? That's a thing he can do. And then there were so many Manhattan-y things in the Jeremy Irons sequence this week. The whole play was exposition about Manhattan and all this kind of thing. I felt like there was so much indicating perhaps Jeremy Irons is playing Manhattan, impersonating a human or something, or all this Manhattan stuff around him, that it started feeling like very Lindelof-y misdirection to me. And I've kind of pulled back to, it probably is Occam's razor, the most obvious thing, Adrian Veidt. And Gig was saying to me that he thinks it's probably just they're not outright confirming it to give the show some air, to give it some space. If he was explicitly Ozzy from the first episode, it would kind of revolve a lot of the discourse of the show around, hey, this is Ozymandias, what's he up to? Making it a mystery kind of forces you to decouple it a little bit, which I like.
And plus, I mean, it is the writer of Lost, so you gotta have some mystery to keep the people coming back every week.
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, why make this mystery? Like, what is it saying about Ozymandias and Dr. Manhattan that there's some kind of mystery over who is who? And I don't know, it can't be that arbitrary, right? It can't just be for mystery's sake.
Well, you haven't read the last part of the book, right? You said? So we can't really spoil for you all
Right.
the details. But let's leave it at, of all the characters in the book, they are the two most overtly fantastical.
Yeah. I feel like, loath am I to say it, but these sequences might be a little arbitrary or functional. I was hailing the first one so much last week, but this one, like, when we hear like the watchmaker's son and I go, oh, that's referencing Manhattan, that's cool. I didn't think we'd actually like get a whole episode about the play. Like the title of the play was enough illusion for me. Then we actually get the play and it's all this backdoor exposition about the comic.
Well, I mean, if you're gonna make a TV show for the stadiums, then you're gonna have to exposit. And I mean, when it comes to Watchmen and stadiums, there's a pretty colorful history there.
It's for the NFL moms.
Again, sorry, not to spoil anything for Dill.
And more importantly, we have to see the play because that's a way of getting Blue Cock in the show. Otherwise, where would it show up?
It's very comic accurate, I thought.
I'm okay with all that. I just feel like all the servants pulling off their masks and revealing their clones, and then actually getting a line about, you're going to be the new Dr. Phillips now. It's all just kind of hammering the weirdness of it a bit far. Whereas in the first episode, I felt like the weirdness was more self-evident. Like, he gives Jeremy Irons a horseshoe and Jeremy Irons sighs, but we don't get him saying, damn it, I designed you to give me cutlery. You're such a failed robot giving me a horseshoe. Whereas this week felt a little more like on the nose to me.
I can see what you're getting at, but I still feel like that first episode segment was pretty goofy for the sake of being goofy at times, and it was some lovely levity. But I don't know. I find it entertaining, but I think maybe you're trying to project some. I'm not going to say project deeper meaning into it. It's supposed to have deeper meaning. I would say that you're trying to read it incorrectly. I would say that you are wrong, Mr. Neal.
Yeah, I think I first thought that these Jeremy Irons interludes would be kind of like the Black Friday stuff, which is like a parallel narrative in the comic that is fictional within the story, but it symbolizes things and it's allegorical for things happening in the main story. Because if we're getting like 9 of these interludes, I feel like they need to have we need a reason to come to this place every week instead of staying in Tulsa. And I just hope I'm more into it being abstract and weird, style exercises than just our exposition every week. But we'll see how it goes. Next week's sequence with Jeremy Irons might be very different. But as for the actual Black Friday-esque stuff, the American Hero story excerpt, I loved that. The Zack Snyder CGI blood and speed ramping. Perfect kind of reference to the film and the style of people like Snyder in general. And you can read that in a way kind of like a nod or kind of like a poke, or you can read that in a very condemning way. I think it's nice and applicable, and it's just a good kind of look at how superheroes get narrativized and that kind of thing. And of course, I think that is an elegant way to do world building and an exposition regarding Hooded Justice. Like, this feels much more cleverly done information to the audience to me than like the Dr. Manhattan play, because here we're learning about Hooded Justice, which might be very, very useful if our idea that wheelchair-bound Will is Hooded Justice, but it feels like in a much more natural way how we're learning about him.
Also, more importantly, I think the American Hero story stuff is much more of a Black Friday thing, Friday, however the hell you pronounce it, because we see it overlaid with Angela, and it's actually responding thematically and contextually to the main story, which is something that the pirate comic did in the comic constantly, whereas the Adrian stuff in the show doesn't seem to respond much to anything else that's going on apart from sort of match cutting in and out of it whenever it turns up. Although, but for the record, I did find this week's Aussie scene very entertaining. More just because it was just hilarious. Like, I just found his mannerisms, the fact he was doing a bit more of the American accent this time, his kind of berating Miss Crookshanks, like, let's see those tears, and just the way they drop the corpse at his feet. It was all a bit of slapstick. I just found it quite funny and absurd. Not quite the Lynchian ambience of the uncanny that we had last week, but I'm okay with more of this.
Just love the shot of Manhattan's penis coming into frame.
Yes.
that was like the greatest moment.
On that note of paralleling stuff in the fictional story, did you notice that the shopkeeper in the American Hero story segment did have a safe? You could see it in one of the last shots of the sequence under the counter. I wonder if you can read into that stuff about Police Chief Judd's hidden robe and stuff, like there actually being something behind the so-and-so or whatever, because I feel like I don't know if we're going to get another American Hero story segment, but it very much like we get the applicable Rorschach-esque monologue from Justice to Angela connecting. Like, I feel like this is meant to be allegorical.
What was the deal with both with the surname Mueller turning up twice, other than possibly a contemporary political reference?
I feel well. There's something about that contemporary reference we can get to a bit later, but I did wonder about that. Because
it's once in a fictional context and once in a historical context.
I mean, the dead strongman guy, he's canon, at least in the timeline or whatever. And I wonder, like, could they be trying to connect this random German woman to him somehow? But I mean, it could just be a coincidence, could just be a common German surname. But like on that note, that whole detail of those German propaganda flyers in the start, that's really fascinating, isn't it? It has quite interesting implications for the hooded justice theory, doesn't it, Neo? Would you like to?
Yeah, well, yes. If wheelchair Will is hooded justice, but one of the interesting things. And one of the issues we were kind of having with this theory last time is there were two things. There are that the area around his eyes seems white in a close-up we get in the comic, and there's that the first Night Owl, Hollis Mason, in his biography writes that hooded justice expressed kind of support for Nazi Germany during, I think, the late 30s, which is a very weird detail for, a person like Will Reeves to espouse. But these propaganda flyers, I think, really elegantly kind of square these things up. They kind of marry into a reason why he could think that. I mean, I know Germany wasn't Nazi at that time of that segment, but it can kind of explain a lingering support and sympathy for Germany, why he might identify them. Because as a kid, we saw him reading the flyer, and you can imagine that really lodging in his brain, because that's on the paper he had from his dad, the only thing from his dad he carried for all his life. So that gives me hope that they'll have a good explanation for the white eyes. Maybe he, you know how Sister Night does the makeup spray on her eyes? Maybe he did something that was white to further hide his identity. If someone got that closer look at him, I feel like this theory is ironclad at this point.
And I have to say, it might be for the best that Tom Tit isn't here this week, because he might be extremely smug when he hears this. But the comment he made last week towards the end about how we're seeing all these mechanisms into which black people are being put to contain them and have them serve other people's interests rather than their own, that's been rattling around my head all week, because I do feel it is so key to the show in a lot of ways. And this thing with the German propaganda flyers seems to reaffirm that so intensely. Because, it proves it so true, because Obi and Will, they might be influenced by some accurate insights about, American hypocrisy and racism, in that flyer, but even the flyer is just a tool of the other side who do not actually care, right? Like Germany was distributing propaganda flyers, saying the opposite message to white people, right? There's some good historical coverage of this. Like they were just throwing out propaganda. They didn't care, right? So it's very much it's really cynical manipulation and just this like using something that's nominally anti-racist in order to just bring everything back into the system. And it's this this idea of a system that you just can't escape, and it's just fundamentally rotten. Yeah, in some way.
On that note, Angela finding the clan robes in Judd's closet, which also was a nod to the comic. In the first issue, Rorschach breaks into the comedian's closet and, his normal identity, and finds the comedian's outfit and realizes, oh, he was the comedian. And so this is a very similar kind of frame sequence. But I feel like the point there, I mean, I don't want to assume too much at this point, so we don't really know Judd's connection to the KKK or his family's connection or any connections to the 7th Cavalry or whatever. But I feel like there's a point being made about authority and policing, and white connections to supremacist movements and stuff that are kind of inescapable in the kind of institutional makeup that we're seeing in the show. So it all feels on this kind of enclosed institutional note that Tom Tit and Gig are talking about.
Bit of a note on that clan robe. I noticed that in PTpedia this week, one of the files is about Judd's history, and they mentioned that his great-grandpa was a cowboy marshal. And a detail about the clan robe that struck me was that it has that sheriff star on it, which was, and obviously Judd's sheriff star was highlighted very significantly at the end of episode 1. So I'm feeling like I think they might be putting emphasis on that, this idea of how the KKK and racism has been entwined with the law, essentially, and how this idea of trusting in the law, might come back to bite you when it comes to institutional evil.
Yeah.
So maybe the robe is a hand-me-down, maybe it's an heirloom from his great-grandpa, or maybe it was his. Maybe he kept it for sentimental reasons, or maybe he actually wore it. Like, I don't know.
Well, it's on that note of like the law not saving you. Like, no one was punished for Tulsa. Like that. Yeah. 100 to 300 people were killed, and like that was it. There was no like investigation there until like the late 80s or something. Like there was no recourse for that, and the recourse is fictional. It's in the show, the reparations for racial violence victims or their descendants act.
Still on the Tulsa thing, you mentioned no one was punished for it. And I don't want to repeat this too much, but going back to the back matter this week, one of the other documents is this sort of hearing, this kind of legal thing about someone kind of petitioning to sort of basically go ahead with the reparations thing for Tulsa. And they make this big argument about it. They lay out the whole case. They lay out how complicit the law was and how no one's been punished. And towards the end, there's something that I think is incredibly important. And I think possibly it might even constitute giving the game away too much regarding the show and where it's going. Because in the conclusion of this argument about why we need these reparations to be made and why this needs to be looked at, they say some things. I've got it written down here. They say, the massacre is not something confined to a span of hours over a period of 2 days from decades ago. This was a crime that has carried forward in time, its traumas and consequences compounding and defining the conditions of their existence across generations unto this very minute. It was also a singular crime that flowed out of countless injustices before it, and so this evil exists on an active and unbroken continuum of history, its degrading effects felt at all points at once. And then they also say that they should in order to they should rehear this, and they should begin asking if adjudicating matters such as these asks us to reconsider linear constructs of time, an obsolete notion that informs almost all of our laws, and adopt a quantum perspective on justice. See, to me, that says Dr. Manhattan. So what do you guys think?
When the early days of the show's subject matter starting to get announced and stuff, my idea was what I thought an episode would be or could be or should be was, well, in the comic, the fourth chapter called Watchmaker, it's probably the most widely loved one, is Dr. Manhattan's backstory, his origin, and it's his experience of time, which is nonlinear. He perceives his consciousness's experience like all at once, past, future, present. And so it's like this nonlinear flash through his present and his past, like piecing together all his story nonlinearly. And I thought this idea of that kind of nonlinear, interconnected storytelling that isn't, going from past, present, future, but it's all things influencing each other retroactively, and this kind of thing would apply really well to racism or racism in America, where like we see the Tulsa massacre tendrils out into the present day, because like generational wealth can't get built up, when these things are like struck down, when people are institutionally oppressed for so long, family stability, all these things, it doesn't just affect the people killed, it courses down through the generations. And I feel like this kind of nonlinear storytelling could work really well for a story about racism using this kind of sci-fi concept, because you can show present, future, and past, how it's all interconnected, and these aren't isolated events, but like institutionally they course out, they ripple back. It's all connected, basically. It all passes down, it all reverberates back. So I think using Manhattan to talk about such a subject is a really cool idea. It's something the comic didn't do. I don't know if Alan Moore's done something similar before, but it feels like a really cool, powerful, worthwhile iteration to do with these characters and these concepts.
When it comes to Alan Moore, well, obviously he's a white dude and he hasn't done some big thing of racism in the past, but the idea of all of time existing at once and looking at how the whole thing connects together and everything flows into each other, that is a very big recurring theme in his work. And in 2016, he dropped his brick of a novel, Jerusalem, which, while it doesn't revolve around racism specifically, but it does revolve quite heavily around the plight of the working class and inequality and pretty much the class struggle, so to speak. And it uses this idea of kind of Dr. Manhattan vision and being able to look down from above at the whole timeline laid out and see how everything connects together in one giant sort of block or kind of lattice. It looks at that in intense detail. So if the show and Lindelof run with this idea of taking that and using it to look at racial injustice, then that could make the show kind of the lost Moore story that never was. Like that would be such a great way to actually expand on and develop one of the running themes of Moore's whole career, like taking that idea and using it to look at it from a justice perspective and from a political perspective, because that excites me so much. Like if this is where the show's going, then I'm really excited about it.
I don't think it is.
Oh, you don't? You don't?
I'm sorry, that sounds amazing, but it's Damon Lindelof.
Okay, but yeah, they're laying the
HBO's
groundwork here.
Yeah, I mean, groundwork is great and all, but
the writers' room is 6 people, and at least two of them are of color. There's one person I couldn't find like any information on. That may or may not be relevant.
Yeah, it's not like the show is a novel written by Lindelof, right? Like this is 9 episodes. You've got 6 people. They'll have been over this storyline. They've tried to come up with the best ideas, respectively. And I want to believe that there's some actual really good ideas bubbling in the works here, and there aren't just things that are just kind of there randomly for no particular reason. I think if they're foreshadowing stuff like this on stuff on the website, there's got to be something coming.
But Gig,
what
has it stopped? No, Miss Crookshanks, it's only just begun.
I think this is a case where in contrast to other shows we've covered in the past, I and Gig tend much toward the aspirational here, because of the level that things are being achieved at already, or being gestured at, or that they're aiming to achieve, the people involved, the subject matter, the source material. It inspires me to hope for more, and maybe I'll get disappointed, but I'm happy hoping for this much, because I think it could pull it off. It may well not, but this isn't something like like certain shows we've covered in the past where I feel drained more and more, and I feel more and more cynical as it goes on with how things progress.
Yeah, Years and Years was really rough towards the end.
Yeah, I would be okay getting disappointed. I'm willing to invest enough in myself, enough in the show, that I could get massively disappointed. Basically, it's inspired enough faith in me for that. So we'll see whether I'm rewarded or punished in the end.
I have faith in Lindelof based on what you've told me. So I'm trusting you.
Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't have laughed at that sentence. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just that dialogue was hilarious. Like I said,
the Watch one.
The Watch one.
I mean, okay, it was funny, but I kind of liked that moment. Like, obviously, it's a bit mystical, it's a bit absurd, but the way he just kind of flicks the watch and time begins again, I think that was just... I enjoy the sort of the kind of the camp and the sort of the theatrics of those scenes in general.
Me too. I just enjoyed them maybe on a different level than Neo did.
Okay.
I hope, I imagine a lot of people understand this, but for anyone that doesn't, tomatoes don't grow on trees. That was the weird thing in that scene. Tomatoes grow on vines, not trees. So there's obviously some genetic manipulation or dreamscapey thing or something off. Because, tomatoes do not grow on trees.
He bit into it, then he squeezed it out on the grass. Like, why did he do that? That really confused me.
I think he was just checking it was a tomato. Like, I don't think he really wanted to eat it. He just wanted to check that this wasn't...
you gotta check that it's right.
Yeah.
Help me out here, because I didn't rewatch last week's afterwards. In this episode, the cake had 2 candles on it. Did it have 1 candle on it last week?
It did
Correct.
indeed.
Ooh, spooky. He's aware that he's a character in a television series. Maybe he is Manhattan.
The theories going around on Reddit and stuff at the moment are like, Adrian's in a tachyon prison made by Manhattan, and he's in a magical prison. I'm not sure about any of that. I do wonder if he could be inside a big biodome, like something like that.
Like Karnak from the comic His Antarctica Hideout. Yes, speaking of theories, my favourite theory is, well, if you've read the comic or seen the film, actually, you'll know there were 2 Bernards. One is a newscaster, and the other is a kid that hangs out near the news. Not a newscaster. One is a
news vendor,
and the other is a kid that hangs out near the news vending station.
And both their names were Martha.
And both their names were Bernard. And my favourite theory that may play fast and loose with developments in the story is that our new Bernard kind of character, the new news vendor, played by the great Bunny Colvin of The Wire in this episode, is little Bernard 2 all grown up.
But isn't he
there are some
thing
slight
that happens
problems, yes.
Still what hasn't gotten to yet?
Don't mind me, you can spoil it.
I think the bigger question regarding that scene is who's Bernadette, so to speak? Who's this little girl who gets off of that fancy white van to collect a huge stack of newspapers for some mysterious benefactor?
Yeah, and that's already been spoiled in the
Shut up!
stuff.
Okay.
Well,
yeah. I mean, we can.
it's
If
pretty
you've been
obvious.
paying attention, you can pretty much figure out kind of what's going on there and who the she is who's reading these newspapers. But it's quite interesting how they're starting to seed that in, isn't it? Like, I'm
Yeah.
just, I've got my eye on all that stuff.
You know, I'm going to pull things down a tad from all that hope we had for things being treated well and developed well. And note, the music from the Tulsa massacre in episode 1 was reprised here when the cops rounded up the guys in Nixonville. Are we getting a little bit of a both sides situation here? Are both events equally bad? Befitting the same music?
Well, you have to remember that Lindelof explained that if you have liberal people in charge of the United States, I mean, that's just as bad, really.
The Libstapo.
I mean, yeah.
I think something we should remember when it comes to the police rounding up Nixonville is that, like, well, I mean, yeah, those guys might be a bunch of kind of racist conservatives and stuff, but that's still a really disturbing, kind of brutal exercise of institutional power on a bunch of poor people. Like, okay, it's not like the same as the Tulsa massacre, but like even in the Tulsa massacre, like institutions and the police were complicit in that. So I think we're meant to be at least a little bit disturbed by what's happening here, even if in our own sick way we might think that, oh, those racists, or they deserve it and stuff. And I have to say, I find it quite amusing how, despite Lindelof's film project The Hunt being pulled from distribution, he's still getting to indulge his fantasy of, meting out violence onto a bunch of rednecks.
The thing is, they're all innocent. Because we have a person who admits to doing the crime, and he would not fit in Nixonville at all, and he isn't there. So I think all these people are completely innocent of the crime too. So yeah, the cops are. I mean, they're not screwing up Tulsa bad, but they're definitely screwing up.
I just now got it. It's like I was going to say, yeah, they're even pulling on Iraq imagery to drive home the point, and then I realized, oh yeah, Iraq was also, a despotic regime that was obviously evil, but also was innocent of the thing that they were being punished for.
I mean, certainly in general, that whole thing of like them just assuming that all the white people in that town are kind of might be involved with terrorism somehow. It's a bit post 9/11, isn't it? Except turned around. So it's that as a whole thing. I can't remember. 9/11 didn't happen in this timeline, did it?
Couldn't
Correct.
possibly.
No,
we even see the World Trade Centers in episode 1. Are we going to touch on Angela's hair?
Ooh, yeah, Angela's hair. Something I noticed, I noticed it properly on the rewatch, but in the flashback, Angela's hair is straightened, and in everything we've seen of her in the present, it's kind of back to its natural curly stage. It's quite an interesting detail. Might not mean anything, but yeah, it's there. What do we think of Angela's stuff in general this episode? Because we haven't talked about her very much so far. I thought she had quite an interesting bit of a trajectory.
I loved the moment where she's in bed, and then she opens her eyes, and that awesome police at work music we got from the pod interrogation in episode 1 starts playing here, and she starts sneaking around with those night owl goggles and getting to work. That was really
great.
Cool.
She's very duplicitous, isn't she? Because there's the time where she pretends to faint, and then there's a bit near the start of the episode where she gets the phone call and she pretends to be shocked and horrified to hear that this guy has died. But her face is just like stone cold. Like it's quite scary actually. She's so capable of just completely faking it and disguising her emotions and manipulating people. Like it's impressive in that way. I think she's kind of growing into a source of I think kind of problematizing her role as the hero slightly. She's getting scarier the more
she's
time
very
goes on.
Rorschach-y.
Yeah.
I love Sister Night. She's great.
Her son's so similar to her.
That was interesting that we got confirmation about what was going on with two black parents having the white adopted kids.
Yeah.
But it does it subtly. You'd only notice if you paid attention to Topher's name.
Mm-hmm. Plus, it also really helps inform his character now that we know sort of his relationship with his siblings. He was the one that saved them, and that really, so that he sort of sees himself as the parent in a weird way.
I wonder what the weapons vendor from Breaking Bad was doing on the porch. Do you think he's like their uncle?
Either that or their grandpa or something like that. He's obviously related to them.
I was just going to say the Manhattan Castle was similar to the Jeremy Irons and the mask. But that's, it was on the news, that castle, so not that weird.
Yeah, there seems to be this recurring motif of the castle being destroyed, because we saw Manhattan demolishing his sandcastle on the moon, and then we see Topher smashing his little magnet castle on Earth. So it seems now that castle is becoming quite a proper recurring motif, and that has me wondering if Ozymandias' castle in Wales or wherever, is that going to get destroyed as well?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, it's going to get blown up at some point.
Oh, maybe those scenes are set, maybe all his scenes are set before the Manhattan news footage in episode 1.
Could be. What do we think of the Mothmen? Speaking of animals, we just had that guy with wings suddenly landing on the car in the middle of the emotional moment between Angela and Looking Glass. That was funny as hell, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's like without mobile technology and the internet and stuff, it's like technological developments have sort of gone elsewhere. So we've got jetpacks and floating Lego.
Well, it's worth noting that the internet and stuff was developed. It was just pushed down by the government, recognizing the implications or where that technology usage could go. But scientists did still make it up. It didn't get widespread.
It's one of the characteristics of the Watchmen world in general that technology was kind of advanced a bit kind of too fast because Manhattan turned up and people started kind of doing all this stuff with his technology. So that's how you have flying ships and holograms and all that sort of stuff. But obviously we had that whole technological backlash after the Squid, so we've kind of stayed at that level. So now we've just got weird flying suits and craziness. Oh, that was such a cute way to homage Mothman from the comic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the police, the White Knight. Could that have been an internal purge? If that was being organized by Judd, and that's why she mysteriously survives despite looking seriously dead there for a minute.
I wonder how the 7th Cavalry got that list of police addresses.
Yeah.
See, it seemed like, but going off the scale of it, it's almost less a purge of specific people and more just like a gigantic blank slate. Let's just reset the whole thing. But we'll keep this one woman on because she's special for whatever reason.
Well, that's the thing. He can decide who to keep on arbitrarily. Yeah. And everybody who resigns, they're not a fit for, his new vision of a police force that's anonymous and masked.
Her ancestry might make her special. I don't know if anyone knows about it besides her grandfather, but
yeah, that's a good point.
The granddaughter of the first, superhero, that's a pretty big thing.
And if Judd is our comedian, then he's definitely still going to be playing a big role in the series going forward.
Yeah.
Speaking of Judd and the comedian, we have that detail in the back matter this week that Judd fought in Vietnam and under no one other than Robert S. Mueller in Vietnam. That's such a bizarre detail. I mean, obviously, Mueller did fight in Vietnam. That's taken from real life, but they've just kind of roped the Judd into it. That's so funny and fascinating in light of recent political history.
Oh, man.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. That's great. I haven't been reading that stuff because
you need to start. Okay, you need to start reading that stuff.
There's a great part in one of the back matter PDFs this week, which is a big call out of why the Tulsa riot is still called a riot. What does that mean? Who are they talking about rioting? What's
a race
race
riot? What is that?
It's a really bizarre wording. Massacre is the correct wording.
Speaking of the White Knight and Angela, did you notice this the second time we've seen Angela being interrupted sort of in the moment by a dramatic event?
What was the first one?
When she's
in the moment.
Having sex with her husband.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
Well, brings us back to the sex and superheroes thing from the comic. Which, again, you're going to get a pretty good look at as you go along.
Hallelujah.
I almost wonder how many of these interruptions for Angela are being it's kind of scheduled or organised, because that phone call coming right at the end when she was about to do some stuff or whatever, suddenly saying, oh hey, by the way, he's your grandfather. It all feels a bit rehearsed, like someone's kind of, he says he's got friends in high places, right? So maybe there's more control going on here than we even realise. I don't think they dropped a moth on her car, but they certainly dropped something on her car at the end.
I hate to be like Mira's here, but I think that's just TV writing. You interrupt. Can we address the how to phrase this? A lot of people have been critical and distrusting of the show because they find the whole premise of the kind of racial inversion. How would you word this? There's got to be a better way to word this.
I don't know. Well, role reversal. I don't know. No, I know what you're talking about. It's the whole thing of like, okay, you got poor whites being brutalized by a minority police force and stuff like that.
I see a lot of people are writing the show off because they find like that premise or that reversal like inherently so dubious as to not give the show, you know, the rope with which to, wow, that's probably a bad
wow, thanks.
Not giving the show the time,
Benefit of the doubt.
yeah. What do you, like, obviously we all don't agree with that, but why? What do we think of this? Do you think people are justified in doing that? Why do you think people are doing that? Yeah, you do?
I think that's justified. I think, honestly, there are 101 red flags about this show, starting with the person writing it and the person very pointedly not writing it. It's kind of it's I can think of any number of reasons not to watch this show, and every single one of them is perfectly valid, to be honest.
What made you persist?
Oh, this. I just like hearing my voice on the internet. But also, I am really glad that I've been watching it because Jeremy Irons is a dream, and Regina King is amazing, and I just like working out the mystery every week.
Yeah.
I find kind of a lot of the kind of slightly kind of petty kind of jabs at the show and some of the discourse from people sort of writing it off and shitting on it. I do find a lot of it is a bit, it's just, there's a lot of bad faith going around, which I do get, because obviously there's no reason to trust some HBO show or some kind of piece of commercial media or some DC adaptation or whatever. There's no reason to trust this stuff or that it will do like a good take on racism or politics or anything like that. But at the same time, like it's actually airing now. Like you can sort of, you know, I mean, okay, you don't have to watch it, but like, I can't help but think that, you know, some of the hot takes about it, like, oh, it's fundamentally wrong to tell a story set in an alternate world where this or that is happening. Like, it's not, like, this isn't Confederate, right? This isn't like Ben
That's exactly what I was
thing. Like, yeah. That's an instructive comparison, actually. Can you imagine if both of those shows were airing at the same time?
I feel like the existence, well, the non-existence of Confederate is part of the context of this series that people have to be aware of, and that's going to inform whether or not people want to get involved with this show, is knowing that this is the same company that in fact greenlit, well, I guess not greenlit because they never produced a pilot, but approved of Confederate.
For context,
doesn't matter.
I don't want to contextualize Confederate. You can, don't Google that. You don't want to know.
There is something fundamentally different with that premise, Confederate, like, oh, what if slavery was still going on, and what we've got here, which is, I think, actually just more of it's a bit of a way to phrase it. I think they're getting at something that's very nuanced and very interesting about kind of real world race relations here, which is that stuff, that sort of Tom T-esque stuff I was talking about earlier, and the way in which you've got a system that's fundamentally can't be redeemed, even if you try to sort of like kind of pile the stuff on a bit. And I think as a continuation of Watchmen, I think it makes sense, because the whole Ozymandias' whole aim in Watchmen was to save the world and create world peace and so on and so forth. And what we've got here is a vision where, you know, we've got this kind of very kind of narrow and kind of pathetic idea of, you know, saving the world and fixing the world in the form of this like endless liberal administration that's not actually solving the core problems and isn't actually dealing with the quite like deadly unaddressed traumas of American history. I think that's I think that's just, as someone, you know, as someone who's not white, as someone who is black, and as someone who, you know, is quite left-wing and quite anti-racist and all those things, this appeals to me a huge amount, and it really pisses me off that people aren't giving the show like its dues. Like, it's got some really incendiary and fascinating stuff to deal with, and yet at the same time you've also got some kind of white critics saying some weird stuff about it as well, even the ones who are praising it. Like Neo, I think we were kind of looking at some of okay, I don't want to sort of go too hard after anyone in particular, but some of the hot takes are like, oh, Watchmen is examining whiteness so well, and it's like, Okay, that's just a subsection of what it's doing, yeah? That's not the whole thing.
It's like pitch perfect parody to watch a show like this and go, oh, it's about the white experience of, all this. Like, oh my God. Like, it's like those people who like announce, it's not my turn to speak about this, so I'm not going to speak about this. I'm not going to publicly air my thoughts on this. I'm not going to narrativize this about myself, and then like tweet that. Like it's
like Lindelof, basically. That's what he does, isn't
it? Yeah. But on your meteor point before there about like the nature of the show and what it's doing, I think, and like how it continues the comic, at the end of the comic, sorry, Dilb, how Dr. Manhattan says nothing ever ends, and like you can kind of read that as a cynical rebuke to, a grand scheme that may not be as perfect as planned. But I feel like the show's really taking that idea of nothing ever ends, and then, in true HBO style, like I go back to The Wire, which was all about like how institutions make it impossible to escape certain cycles, just because things are so institutionally baked into societies. Like individual actors can sometimes liberate themselves, but in general, economically and socially, people are screwed because of how these institutions are set up. I feel like nothing ever ends. We're getting that explored why nothing ever ends in this show. Even if the Tulsa police force is full of black people, why are racial tensions like the way they are? Even if red fedations happened, why did things not seem to necessarily improve? And I feel like people I respect, even say, oh, the show is about reparations cause dystopia, both sides this, both sides that. And I feel like it's
that's reductive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very
saying
reductive.
That it's just reparations cause dystopia. Like, no, it's showing how a bunch of different factors are at play here.
I feel like it's like taking nothing. It's the comic ends with nothing ever ends, and I feel like the show is going, but why? Why does nothing ever end? And it's exploring that.
Speaking of things not ending, what do we think about Joe Keene Jr., or whatever his first name is, like the Senator Keene, who is the descendant of Keene of the Keene Act from the comic? This guy who's this conservative politician who's turned up in the plot and is kind of loitering around, and Judd's wife used to work for him, and he seems to be embedding this whole thing. It seems like he might be gonna turn it into some sort of flashpoint issue for his personal political ends. What do people think about that?
I think he's not great, Bob.
So what is the Keene Act? It was like something to do with like a
outlawing
superhero registration act or something like that.
Outlawed everyone except Comedian and Manhattan because they worked for the government.
Yeah, basically there was a police strike, which gets kind of exposited on later on in the comic, and as a response to that, the lawlessness that erupted, because what would you do without cops? You have this thing where basically they banned the masked vigilantes, and in the not to go back to the back matter again, except that's exactly what I'm going to do, but I think they mentioned that there's sort of an amendment made to that act at some point, which permits people like sort of Angela to sort of do stuff. I might be mixing it up. Yeah, something like that. So it's okay if you're police, but not if you aren't.
Well, it's because it seemed the proportionate, like when you have a terrorist group that are going after police specifically because of their doxes, because of their addresses and names, like masks aren't a crazy response to that. I think that's it's like wild that this would happen in the first place, but it's a pretty logical response is to anonymize the police. So an amendment was made to let Tulsa, and I got the vibe this might not be the only place this happened. Like we're focusing on Tulsa, but I feel like in a country with racial tensions this high, this may have happened somewhere else as well. Perhaps at least some cops needing to go masked, although authority couldn't be. That's why Judge Crawford, the chief, had no mask, is because part of the deal with the amendment was there had to be transparency with leadership. Yeah.
I noticed, despite them giving like you say, an understandable explanation for why the cops get to wear masks and stuff, they very much made the point that the theme of the show is still, people with masks, you can't trust them. And I think we're seeing how this whole, lack of accountability that comes with everyone being masked is just sort of, even if you've got, black people in the police force or whatever, it's still festering this unpleasant kind of proneness to brutality and egoism and kind of all these unpleasant kind of traits that are already in the police force. discourse, but are being amplified by the sheer anonymity that they now have. So, and it's kind of like, so it's like you're seeing basically a problem that can't be resolved. Like, okay, the cops are going to get killed unless they wear masks, but if they wear masks, then they'll get worse than they already are. So, like, what are you going to do? You know, it's very much, it seems to unintentionally or otherwise, it's making an argument for just getting rid of the whole system, I think.
It was interesting that Joe Keane seemed quite insensitive of Angela's secret identity, considering his relation to the Keane acting. Like, I don't know if he forgot or, like, just didn't know that she retired.
I noticed that Judd's wife Jane, she seems to know definitively that Angela's still active, because she leaned in and was like, go get the fuckers that did this. I'm so on whether Joe Keane actually knew or whether he was just being, like, oblivious. But, you know, something's going on there. I wonder about Jane, actually, because they said that she used to work for him, and I'm just wondering, is she part of the conspiracy? I don't know. Like, if Judd was, then maybe she was too.
Oh, that means she's Republican.
Oh yeah, good point. Or she was at one point. Speaking of Republican presidents, I just find the whole thing of the Nixon idol and Red Scare's like ultimate threat to the poor whites being, we'll tear down your idol of Nixon. I just find that hysterical. I think it's just one of the touches
Again,
that just kind
Iraq.
Yeah, it's one of the touches of political absurdism that I just find very immensely entertaining. And I think on top of the whole thing, even with American Hero Story, there is something that I think is a bit true to Alan Moore with this stuff. Maybe not Watchmen specifically, but he does like to just kind of shamelessly do kind of these pulpy just pastiches of stuff and Americana. Like in the comic Promethea, you have all these kind of satires of kind of the utter trash pop culture that people watch, like a show about like a sad donkey or something like that. He likes that kind of stupidity and absurdity with stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it shows.
I was about to say a sad horse then, and I realised that's an actual show in real life. So just pulled back from that one. I like the show, to be fair. Okay, if no one's got anything else to say, there's one more thing. There's one thing that's been nagging at me. There's a work of theory by someone. It's called Black Skin, White Masks, and I've forgotten who authored it, but I googled it yesterday. It's quite famous, and it's by a black guy, and it's basically it's quite old as well, and it was about the colonial subject and how black people who were kind of displaced into America had to basically undergo this process of almost unblacking themselves because they're surrounded by cultural representations of the black person as the villain and blackness as bad thing, so they have to kind of remodel themselves to fit in with white society. So even if they gain status, freedom, wealth, they still have to kind of remake themselves in these kind of white masks. And I'm wondering if they're researching a show, you know, about race and people who wear masks, they must have touched on that at some point. I haven't really seen anything in the show that's referred to that yet, except possibly that propaganda poster that Angela saw in episode 1 with Dollar Bill with that sort of black kind of crook figure, that caricature. But I'm wondering if that'll come up at some point. That's been nagging at me.
Yeah, the thing I've got written down is the woke FCC.
Oh yeah, that massive content warning before the show. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I think it's fitting that it comes before a Zack Snyder film.
See, I wonder about it because it seems like a bit of an odd choice of target for this setting, to be honest. Because the whole thing seems to be kind of taking the piss out of this whole idea of like a liberal kind of regulation and stuff, and this ultimately is kind of weak reforms and stuff and reformism. And with this whole thing of like, we've got these sensitive millennials who need all these trigger warnings before their media and stuff like that. That seems like a slightly different sort of target, because rather than targeting people who get offended if you point out like Hillary Clinton's war crimes or whatever, it's going after like sensitive, vulnerable like teenagers and students and stuff. And that's just weird. Now I think it's something that's a bit dangerous to blur the lines between almost, because it's a bit of a weird sort of triangulation of target.
Sort of thing that you might write if you were a really hack writer.
yeah, exactly.
Sort of thing you might write if you were the sort of person who would write a movie about cowboys and aliens.
I wonder if in this world, instead of cowboys versus aliens, they have pirates versus ghosts, considering that's what the kids were playing at in this episode. Does anyone find it odd that Looking Glass wears his mask at home while he eats and watches TV?
No, I totally buy that. It's like a security thing, kind of.
Yeah, that's his face.
Very in keeping with the Yeah, well, you'll see, Dill.
Also, the emotional security as well, because he uses his mask to cry under when he feels big boy tears. That was an interesting detail.
It was the dud line of the week, I think.
That was the dud line. Oh, man. It's only just begun.